I'm not sure what questions Eric was going to ask you. I've been having a question I've been wanting to ask you for a while. It's actually on a little bit different subject, like it's heroin addiction. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Or...
I've known a number of people who are heroin addicts, but usually they are aware of the complications that are involved with continual use, and they try to go into a very flat volume of use and stay there. And if they don't, they are in trouble. But even there, you have the continual loss of response to heroin, and the temptation is to increase the dosage to get your response back. And I think therein lies the one of the evils of that particular form of addiction. You just increase the dosage. Same with amphetamine or methamphetamine, especially methamphetamine.
How was meth? I mean, it's not really the same thing, is it? Or, I mean...
Oh, no, methamphetamine is the one that gives you the compulsion to get further and go further into it deeper. You like where you are, where you're getting, and you want to get deeper into it and lose track of the fact that you are going to get out of control entirely. The idea is, so what? I mean, I like where it goes. It's a favorite thing, not mine, but they will say to themselves, it's something I really like, and it's worth the risk. And it often leads to some pretty bad dependency.
Yeah. It just sort of happened, too. You know?
I've never really allowed myself to get to liking something so thoroughly that I will use it continuously. No, that's not true. I do that with red wine. I like red wine. But I do periodically just stop all kinds of association with wine, just to make sure that I'm not dependent upon it. Mm-hmm. And I find I can stop and survive perfectly well.
Yeah.
It's. I've known a number of people who have become dependent in strange ways on drugs like that, and the long-term track record is not always good, because they a tendency to like what it achieves and really want more of it. It's like any particular thing in which you have an unbalanced liking for. It's not at all uncommon to increase the volume, increase the intensity, increase the complexity of what you're taking to get more new experience. And that leads to difficult to backtrack change in behavior pattern. You get into the pattern of increasing your response, increasing the dosage, and liking what it does even more. And the end of that is disaster.
What about some of the treatments like methadone? Do you know anything about
methadone? Methadone has its form of dependency too. And I've never tried methadone. I do not know what it does personally. But I know of people who have gotten into methadone as a way of alleviating other dependencies, and in turn find that methadone itself has a reward that they like.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's what they said. But I've heard, it's kind of dopes you up too,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So...
it's a narcotic.
But then how does that relate to, like, psychedelics? Like, you're talking to them, they say, like, it's like uppers versus downers or something.
Well, a lot of people are very much addicted to certain of the psychedelics.
Yeah.
They like what they have. They like it very much. I mean, I've been in groups where the marijuana is struck up and passed around, and the people look forward and they gather into this. And that's why in my personal world, I make a certainty of not getting any routine usage of any psychedelic drug. Partly, I want to keep a clean liver and a clean response to new things. Mm-hmm. My thrill is finding new materials, not.
So how do you find that balance then between, testing time or the creativity, but then, again, not getting into any of these dependency routines?
Well, what I do, I keep myself more or less virgin clear, so I can try new materials.
Right.
And see what their activity is. And I want to stay without any clutter from known materials when I'm testing something new. Because when you have two drugs at once, you have a new drug.
Yeah.
And that I don't want to complicate the interpretation.
Right. So what role do you see of like the mushroom, like the Omnium muscaria? Like what part does that have to play? You know, I don't know, like Santa Claus or, you know, or...
Well, one thing about natural materials such as that, and I've done not a great deal with mushrooms, but quite a bit with cactus, is that I find that there are 3 different groups of professional directions that people use to identify a cactus. You have the botanist who can interpret the origins, the find little connections, differences, what have you. You have the chemist, analytical chemist, who defines what a cactus is by what's in it, not what it looks like, but what's in it. And you have the pharmacologist who defines a cactus by what it does. And they can totally disagree on 2 things being the same species or different species. And each has, in a professional sense, knows that his method is superior to the other 2. And you get some very strange results.
Is it constant bickering?
Oh, yeah.
Is it?
Well, one of my interesting ones I followed, I got a mailing from some people up in the Sacramento area of Lobevia. They call it Lobevia grandiflorus. It's a cactus, a small, quite spiny cactus. And Lobevia was the genus name they gave it, they knew it had, which is Bolivia with the B and the L interchanged. So Bolivia became Lobevia, and it comes from Bolivia. And so they called it Lobevia grandiflorus was the botanical name. Then a friend of mine from from Washington, came down and said, that's not a Lobevia grandiflorus, that's a Trichoceros grandiflorus. It's really a Trichoceros genus. And then a good friend from the Los Angeles museum, plant museum, what do you call it, herbarium, visited and said, that's not a Trichoceros grandiflorus, that's a Trichoceros lobevioides. So that was the 3rd name I put down in my notes. And then now all the Trichoceros cacti, by people who want to be associated with and have a fundamentally well-recognized and a voice of authority position, say, actually, Trichoceros really is Echinopsis. And so all these things should be Echinopsis lobevioides. And so now you have 4 names, each having its own defender, and each in conflict. That's why sometimes botanical meetings are really fascinating to listen to and watch, because you have 4 different territories, 4 different people, 4 different disciplines, all disagreeing and all knowing that they are correct.
At the same time.
At the same time, you know. No,
So is that like where the true science goes on then? Is that,
Well, I think things of that type give a strange definition to science. But by being the source of and to the creator of the genus, you are more apt to get tenure in the botany department at the university and get a position of some recognition and perhaps...
So at the end there is a little bit of a race, perhaps.
Yeah, associate editor of a botanical journal. Yeah. I mean, you can write a book about a cactus that you discovered or you gave a name to, only if you give a name to it. So very often, people in the botanical area try to take the charge of the department by being the one who wrote the book and has, in essence, he's the giver of the name. And he identifies it by that name. And you have this little ego balance that...
Perhaps counterproductive, maybe?
Interesting to follow.
Well, Sasha, I'd like to ask you some questions of a more personal nature. Your childhood sounds fascinating, and I'd like you to tell us a little bit about how you grew up and your Russian roots and a few other things.
I actually had 3 crib languages, Russian and French and English. My mother was American. I spoke English with a slight Illinois accent. And my father's from Russia, and his English was compromised a little bit. He had an accent, but he spoke fluent Russian, sort of a Ural Mountain in between dialect. And when they were teaching during the day, the gal who came in to take care of me spoke French. And I spoke to each of them, and not it took quite a while to realize they're different languages.
Oh my.
You just speak in a way you're understood,
Exactly. Yeah.
and you speak back again. And it was not until I was about 3 years old or thereabouts that my parents were told that any child who speaks more than one language speaks none of them well. And so they chopped out the Russian and chopped out the French. And just English was the only language spoken at home.
That's not true.
Oh my.
Of course, not true at all. But that was what they were told, and they believed it. So I've recovered my French pretty well, and spent a year in France just polishing off the Parisian accent.
Well.
Yeah. No, that was marvelous. I was taking tutoring lessons in French to help recover it by a young fellow about 28 years old in Berkeley, on the Berkeley campus. And I asked him if he would be interested in being a tutor to recover French. He said, the only requirements I have would be that you are playing the role of my father, and I'm playing the role of your 2-year-old child. And the only requirement is, see, I'm at the age of 2, I can't read a dictionary. I can't read and confirm anything in writing. And at the age of 2, I can't take notes because I can't write. I'm too young to write. And the only requirement I would have of you is we never speak another word of English. He said, okay, let's try it. And so he went as my father, and I played the role of a 28-year father. I played the role of a 2-year-old child. And slowly the French began coming back in through the baby things. And it went on for about 2 weeks. I was spending a lot of time with him. And about 2 weeks into it, I made some comment, also in French, of course. I made some comment about such and such in the politics situation. And he said, that's not so. And I said, Dad, this is so. I've heard it and I believe it. He said, son, that is not so. It is. It is not. And I said, fuck you, Dad. In French, of course. Oh, he got mad. And my learning curve shot up unbelievably.
There you go.
Because what happens when kids get into school? They have to defend themselves, they are attacked, they get this, and they learn the language by interacting with other people who speak the language. And I had another week or two of tutoring, and I said, I'm ready now to go back to Paris.
There you go.
And it worked out very well. It's one of the cosmopolitan cities. Yeah. I define a cosmopolitan city as a city you may be taken to, blindfolded, moved to some place, you don't know where you are, they take the blindfold off, and you see, I have never been here before. It's Paris, of course. Just the city just has that rhythm and feel and smell, so to speak. And San Francisco fits in that category.
Yeah.
Paris, Barcelona, and Sydney in Australia.
Oh.
Those are what I call my 4 cosmopolitan cities.
Awesome.
A little bit more of your early years. Your parents were what? Musicians?
No. They're in teachers. They were both
teachers.
My father came over on the Trans-Siberian Railway after the revolution. He was on the wrong side of the revolution, so he had to get out of Russia. Mm-hmm. But he came up through Manchuria and down, eventually in Japan. And it's about 1922 or 23, I forget who was president at the time, sort of opened the doors of San Francisco to Russian refugees. And there's a whole San Francisco has had an immense Russian colony.
Yes.
As Paris, the ones who came west went to Paris, and there's a big Russian colony in Paris.
We
figured out how Trader Joe got all his bargains online.
One of our interviewees was sampling a fair amount of Joe before we came, and so he starts out with some toast, and we toasted to Trader Joe, and I said maybe it would be a new model for our interviews. Usually people will ask us if we'd like a glass of wine after the interview, but this is the first time that we ever got asked to have some wine before the interview.
From Trader Joe's $2 truck, I think is
But he gets frantic bargains from time to time as he goes in. He waves grocery bags full of $1 bills.
Yeah.
They're getting, nasty letters from the bank,
He's English, born on the Isle of Wight, and very funny. Has that typical different way of expression with that English edge, and it's we've had a lot of fun with this project.
Well, the red wine which I have now is the Rossi.
Yep.
which I find the different stores have it at different prices. And they have the Merlot, they have Zinfandel, all that sort of thing. Yeah, okay. The thing that is called Burgundy is really a deceptively good wine. And you can get it, if you go to a rolling liquor store, it'll be $12.99 for a 4-liter bottle. But you go to something like Ace Hardware or Rite Aid. It's $7.99 a bottle.
Yeah.
You get 4 liters of, and I pulled this up at the Grove a couple of times, in which a wine expert was up there, and he brought some of his very good wines, and I happened to have a bottle of the $7.99 Rossi thing, and he wanted me to taste his wine, and he made the mistake of stepping out of the room for a minute, the area, and I switched wines. Oh no! And he is the wine expert. And he tastes. Oh, this has changed his taste. You know, it has an interesting bouquet, though. He didn't know that I had switched wines, and I decided for a while, I thought about the pros and cons of telling him. I decided not to tell him.
There you go.
Just let it be. And he's thinking he's drinking his good wine.
So you got an honest opinion on the wine.
Yeah.
But
that's funny.
He thought it was good wine.
Yeah.
And I've tried the Merlot and the Zinfandel, and they're okay, mediocre. But the thing called Burgundy, which doesn't make any sense at all, is good.
How do they get those bargains, though?
That's the price it is. It runs between $8 and $12 a bottle. It's a 4-liter bottle, and it'll last if you're a little careful, even the third day.
Well, let's get back. You were just telling us about how your father came across Siberia on the railroad, on the Sacramento Northern, on the Trans-Siberian Railway, and he told me a lot about that trip. It's quite remarkable. Such things as he went from actually not from Moscow, but from the Chelyabinsk in the area where the train goes through, but in the Urals where he lived. And he just got on the train and kept heading east. And it's a several-day trip across Siberia. But he told me interesting things such as the people who live in the territories the train goes through there must be 15 different languages and 15 different cultures and different types of people. Some wear pants and some wear skirts, and some women wear pants and some wear skirts, and they speak different languages, what have you. And he's intrigued with the fact that each of the stations, with 2 exceptions, had only one toilet for the people on the train, and it had a lock on the inside, so the sex was defined by who was in there, and he or she would lock the door and got up. But a couple of the train stations had 2 toilets, and one for men and one for women. But if they all speak different languages and wear different costumes, how are you going to tell and internationally not know who it is, which is the men's and which is the women's? And he says it's very simple. What they did, on the men's they put 1 circle, on the women's they put 2 circles. And apparently it was immediately known this is the woman's and that's the man's. And it was, the little details like that are absolutely charming. Yeah.
But anyway, the president at that time, 1922 thereabouts, and I cannot remember who it was. One of them was assassinated. Was it Harding?
Harding, and he died in office.
That was it.
Yeah.
But he opened up the San Francisco to Russian immigrants. And they over in Fillmore Street, roughly Fillmore Street and Geary, in that area in San Francisco, they all spoke Russian. And you get Russian breads and Russian candies and Russian foods there, Russian caviar. And we'd go over every week or two and load up on Russian goodies.
Yeah.
But then he got involved with my mother-to-be, and they fell in love and got married, and I was the product of that, the only child.
Yeah.
But she taught at Willard High School, and he taught down in Oakland. And he was an interesting teacher. He had pretty much difficulty with English. English is a new language for him. But also he was a good disciplinarian and a nice disciplinarian. And he was given, at that time, Oakland's minority was Portuguese. And these Pachucos were everywhere, including in the high schools and junior high schools. And they were a band of self-contained, superior people, and they would be like troublemakers. I remember one time he said I was in the front of the class, and I heard this loud whistling. I just blew the loud whistle. And it turned around and everyone was innocent. No one I knew what was going on. And so he went over to the side where, writing on the blackboard, where there was a bookcase with glass that reflected the glass. And he saw this one person go up with his 2 fingers into his mouth and make a loud whistle scream. He turned around, everyone was innocent. He went over to the person and said, Did you just whistle just now? Oh, yes, Doc, yes, I did. I have a whistling tooth. I have a whistling tooth in here. Oh, my father said. He brought his fist down and whacked that side of his face. Do you have a whistling tooth on the other side, too? No, just that one. No more whistling. But that kind of discipline kept him in order. And then he found out that by going out and behind the junior high school, this is in Oakland on Foothill Boulevard, they had little plots of grass about 9 by 9. And he got them as lawns. And he got them interested in putting flowers around these little paths of lawns. And that's how they took their aggression out. They put those flowers in, designed it, created it, watered it, and no one dare touch those flowers because they were being protected by authority, them. And their pride was transferred into that.
Yes.
And he said that was the end of any problems.
That's
Little
a sweet
things like
story.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting, yeah.
How did your father and mother meet?
My mother was a teacher in Berkeley, and they bought a house on Spruce Street. How they met, I don't remember. I don't know. I was told, and I don't recall.
Well, here's one I'm sure you remember. How did you and Ann meet, and would you tell us about the early days of meeting Ann and beginning to work with her?
Well, I married a woman that I quite fell in love with, and we had one child. And I was married to her for about 20 years, and she died of a stroke. And I was with her and a couple of friends of mine as she died in the hospital. You could see the heartbeat just slow down, and then just stop entirely. And so I lost her. My son was about, probably 20, 25 years old at that time. We'd been married about 20 years. And then I was sort of a freelance. I did not know where to go, what to do. I fell in love with a German girl in Heimersheim. And Heimersheim, where was it in Germany? I forget the name of the city. In Germany. And the complication, which was not a complication, was she was happily married to a German fellow, too. And they had a pharmacy. And she was what would be the term? Not an animus woman, which is a woman who pushes her sexual superiority. She would be called an anima woman instead of an animus, an animal. And she knew that I was a person without a female thing, and her husband went right along with it. And we took a trip over to Paris and spent a couple of weeks together, one thing or another. And the husband took care of the pharmacy. That worked out, the apotheca. And that worked out quite well. But I knew this couldn't be a long-term, and if I got involved with someone else, that relationship would fall apart. But I did get involved with someone else, namely with Ann, at a meeting at someone's house in Berkeley. And we just sort of struck a good relationship going. And then she had the complication of knowing that I was in love with the wife of a German pharmacist. And she didn't know quite how to break that apart, or where she should. And in fact, that's part of the early chapter in Pikal, is how to make this relationship work or not work, to try it out. And she wrote that beautifully. And we established a good rapport. This is, 28 years ago. And we've been married very happily for pushing 3 decades.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit, if you would, about the writing process for you. I'm a writer, and I know lots of different writers, and people have different methods of getting the words out of their mind and onto paper and into a form that it can become a book or an article or whatever. Are there some general things you can tell us about how you and Ann worked together to produce a book?
Interestingly enough, we did not really work together. She is the author of half the book, and I'm author of half the book. And we say this was Ann's story. We call Alice in the book. or my story, I think Assura, or I forget what it's called in the book. And we are entirely different writing techniques. But the writing, you can tell from the writing which is doing the writing. Anne is a much more polished writer. On the other hand, I use peculiar approaches in use of words and sentences. So we have two different styles entirely. And rather than trying to make a common style for the two of us, we just kept our individual identities. And that worked out very well.
So is there, when you're on a book, is it slow and steady, or is it a passionate burn to the finish?
It's pretty well, it is your total project. And I'm in a book right now that is gotten out of hand. It's I've heard of it with the Merck Index.
Yes.
This is modeled on the Merck Index. I call it the psychedelic index. But the idea is to have every compound that is known to be psychedelic, or is been tried but not yet found to be, has not been tried high enough and may never be, or is so chemically closely related in structure that it should be tried, is in the book. And its structure and its synthesis and its biochemistry and its natural sources and its pharmacology, its legal status, all these things are under the compound. Every single statement is documented. So the bibliography is monstrous already. And I've split it into two books. The phenethylamines and tryptamines, and I want to finish the phenethylamine half of the book as a first volume. And I would estimate at this point it's about 2,000 compounds and about 2,000 pages. And I still have half a year to go on it. And I haven't been in the lab for over a year because I'm spending my time on that book. I want to get it done. And it's not pro-psychedelic. It's not anti-psychedelic. It's just factual information on each compound. And every comment is documented. So I think it'd be a very excellent reference book for people who want to get into the chemistry of psychedelics. Excellent reference book, people in law enforcement who want to learn about the chemistry of psychedelics. It's all in there, goods and bads, and all documented. That's my current manic project.
Well, I'd like to know a little bit more about how you indeed began your life work. I understand that you took a degree in chemistry. Started work with a chemical company.
I took a bachelor degree in chemistry, but I was careful to get a Bachelor of Arts degree, not a Bachelor of Science degree, which gives you a little bit more, not less focusing on the subject and more in general on a broad education. And then I may have mentioned this the other day to you. The University of California had a biochemistry department. And no one in the biochemistry department knew about biology, but almost none of them knew anything about chemistry. And biochemistry should be biology and chemistry. And so I went down and went into the Department of Biochemistry and had no trouble sailing through to a PhD in about 3.5 years, getting it in biochemistry. Because once you get a PhD, it doesn't matter what the topic is. If you have the degree, it gives you a little bit better position for what have you. I worked at a small company that's just being formed in Berkeley called Biorad. It's now a monstrous $1 million company. But at that time, there were 5 people. I was one of 5 people who were running the chemistry of the place. And I was offered a position of ownership, partial ownership, and I very fortunately said no. Because had I been an owner, I'd be now a millionaire, but I would be probably with an ulcer and no work of my own. I'd be stuck by the company, so I just said no. And I split from there and was offered a position of as a research chemist at Dow Chemical, which at the time had its West Coast laboratory in Pittsburgh, out near the Antioch Bridge. So I went working for them about 1957 or so. And when I went there, one person, a chemist I kind of worked with, had just found a new way of making a very rare organic chemical by a trick accident he discovered as meta-T-butylphenol. And that was one of 2 or 3 compounds they could make a lot of, as they could find a use for it. And I looked at it and I said, well, gee, if you make it into a dimethyl thing and put a amine group between the two alkyl groups and make the carbamate, you probably would have an insecticide. Try it, make it. So I made it, and it turned out to be an insecticide that was patented and almost went commercial. And their argument is, you can predict structures like that from what you see. Why don't you do just whatever you want to do, and we'll patent it and take advantage of it. Then it's be on your own. Well, about that's the time I had my first mescaline experience, in about 1940, probably about in the late 1950s. And I said, what I want to do is find out why mescaline does this to you. At that time, I still thought the psychedelic drugs did things to you. I did not realize psychedelic drugs, as I now realize, let you do things. They catalyze your doing of things. You don't have a visual experience all wrapped up in a few milligrams of white solid. It's wrapped up in you. And these are the catalysts that let it out. And with that in mind, I said, I'm going to make different variations of mescaline. I was totally won over by mescaline as a guide. And put the groups on here, put the groups on there, rearranged groups, did all kinds of chemistry. And as I did these sort of things, I published them. And after about a few years of this, the authorities at Dow said, this is all right to go that way. We'll patent some of them when we find them of interest. We'll screen them back in our Midland laboratories. But you should not really publish from here because it associates the company with psychedelic drugs kind of things. So I said, I'll publish from my home address. They said, fine, that's okay. So from there on, I began publishing with my home address as the return, not Dow Chemical Company. And after about a couple of years of this, they said, this is not good because you're still associated here. At which point I took a year and went to the junior college out there in Walnut Creek area near Concord, and took the three of the courses that I needed to do to get into medical school. At which point I quit Dow, just left them and went to medical school. And I applied to San Francisco Med School, and I learned a lot about how you apply and have interviews by what I was told and what I learned by trial and error. And same thing with bar exams. People who fail bar exams for the same reason they fail entry exams into medical school is they don't know how to answer the questions. And you're almost always asked two questions. One is, why do you want to go to medical school? Well, obviously, you want to become a physician, help people who in good health, and help people become better and well, and all that kind of stuff. No problem. And the second question is, what is your opinion about the U.S. role in Vietnam? There is the question you have to think over carefully, because you don't know what the background of the person who's going to read that question is. Is he pro or anti? And so you have to answer it in a way that would satisfy the person regardless of his attitude. And so my first opening sentence on that reply is, I heartily approve of what we're doing there, and totally disapprove of the way we're doing it. I got in. So I was in medical school. I wanted only the first 2 years, which the first 2 years tell you how things should be. The second 2 years of the med school tells you how to get them back to working that way if they're wrong. And I did not want to practice medicine. I just want to know how things should be if you're correct. So I took 2 years in medical school, then I split out of medical school. I did not want a medical degree. It would be absolutely disastrous because you have to follow the rules of the physician's structure. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to have my own rules. So I went across the street to Langley Porter and spent a year in psychiatry as, again, a person just coming in. Not 2 years, which gives you a psychiatric background, just 1 year to learn how normal people would think and operate. But the second year is how you get them to think that way again if they're not well. And I didn't want that. I just wanted the information how they should be. And I split out of that school and got a consulting job here, there, yonder. And it turned out more and more of the consulting jobs I got were themselves quite biased. Such as I was a consultant down at a little company down in, it's actually a government laboratory down in the Palo Alto area. And they were very much into making compounds that might be good for training people on space travel, where they would be isolated from gravity, isolated from interaction with new events, and develop drugs that would allow them to be trained by almost loss of consciousness, but not quite in a psychological sense. Cute idea. And so I set up a little laboratory for them down there, one thing or another. And I came in one day, and the gal at the desk said, by the way, before you go in the lab, could you sign this paper? I said, what's the paper? Oh, it's the thing that gives you green clearance or red clearance or something like that. I said, what's green or red clearance? What's this clearance nonsense? Well, what it is, I found out, is that the laboratory that I was setting up was not going to be for space people. It was going to be for chemical warfare and developing weapons of that type. And this was a thing that allowed me clearance, but it also would restrict me from talking about it, because I signed a thing that says I'll behave and not talk about it. And so I turned that back to her, and I walked out and never came back. And so that avoided, fortunately, being trapped in any way. At which point, since I've been publishing a lot from my home address, I built my own lab out behind the house. It was the basement of a house we built for rental sometime. The house burned down, but the basement was concrete, and we put a roof over it. And it had a nice fireplace, and that was my lab, and it still is. And so then I published for my home address, because that was my legitimate place where the lab is. Had a lot of interesting fun with the DEA. At that time, it used to be the Bureau of Narcotics. And then it evolved out into, that was fine when you had just cocaine and morphine or heroin, that Bureau of Narcotics. Then about 1930, or there at mid-30s, 36, 37, one person who became quite notorious in the Bureau there decided that marijuana should be on that drug. This is called the Narcotics Bill, Harrison Narcotics Act, that was it. And he put marijuana on there, so the old-timers in the government laboratories looked upon marijuana as a narcotic, and it's one of the three narcotics. You had heroin, you had heroin and morphine, you had cocaine, and you had marijuana. And so this was fine until about the 1960s or so, when you had the Haight-Ashbury and all the Summer of Love in San Francisco, at which point everything from LSD to this to that flooded the streets, and you couldn't call them narcotics. And so they were not controlled by the Bureau of Narcotics. And so they got the FDA involved. And they got the FDA, and they called it the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, BNDD, which is the Bureau of Narcotics and the FDA working together. And the FDA would take care of these kind of drugs, and the Bureau of Narcotics take care of those kind of drugs. And so you had these people. If you wore a red tie, you were this group. If you wore a green tie, you were that group. And they would compete with one another as to who would do what and who would get more credit for one thing or another. And the whole thing about 1970 got totally out of hand. And they dissolved the whole thing and made it into the Drug Enforcement Administration. And that was created about 1970 or so, in which all these things were considered scheduled drugs.
Right.
And at that point, I worked a little bit with them, partly because I did some lecturing and seminars in their group in San Francisco, but also it allowed me to get a license from them to have scheduled drugs and to do research. Research, you have to get permission of the state and of the government to do research with Schedule I things. But I got the permits, and that they were kind of reasonably okay with that until about 1985. This is where they passed the law making MDMA illegal. One of the first people to publish the human activity of MDMA, and this that was called ecstasy or something along that line. And they were quite unhappy with that, and so they actually came out to the lab. They wanted to make sure that everything's all right. And that was the first chapter of the second book, was the narcotics group coming out. And they wanted my license, but they couldn't take it because they had awarded it to me. And so they did not want to approve any more research I wanted to do. So I stopped asking for approval and gave them the license back. So now I'm working without a license, but the simplest thing is to not work with any scheduled drugs. And so I did no more research with scheduled drugs at all. And I figured I'll make my own drugs and find their activity and publish them and let them have the problem of making them scheduled. So I was a few years ahead of them, and that worked out quite well. So in essence, I dissolved my relationship with the federal government. This is where about this time I met Bob, who's up here as for a second time. He was the head of the chemistry group in the DEA. And he resigned because he couldn't take the way it was going. It was going from a family to an aggressive batch of self-empowered people. And he couldn't take that transition, so he just quit, retired early. And I just had no more to do with it whatsoever, and it worked out quite well. I'd have no license on the wall. On the other hand, they did make a visit in about 1990-something, and went in, and they went inside and the lab and the house. Didn't happen to have a search permit, but that's okay. That rarely stops the people in authority. No, we call it a signed slip of paper that gives them permission of the court to extract these cases.
Judge reviewed it,
yeah,
you know?
and that was fine. And after about several hours of snooping around here, and he phoned a person I know who's a DEA chemist, and the chemist said, you'll find hundreds of white solids in there, and you may take probably samples of all of them, but said you'll run them and you'll find they're not scheduled drugs. They're things you don't even know what they are. They're new compounds. And they more and more realized that this was a laboratory of creation and new things, and not a manufacturing. A lot of the people in authority hear the word lab, and they have two things that are synonymous, lab and drug lab, and they're the same thing. So once they see a lab, they know it's a drug lab, and they try to find evidence to establish it, and they couldn't do it because there was nothing illegal going on there. And so I gave the permits back and let them have them, and things were pretty well inactive for up to about a year or two ago, in which way an interesting thing occurred. There's a person in Canada, Richard Lang, who's the head of the Canadian equivalent of the DEA. And he asked me if I would write a chapter for a book he's editing on the forensic background of hallucinogenic drugs or hallucinogens or something like that. I said, sure. So I wrote a chapter for him, about 80 pages, and it appeared in the book, and he gave me 2 or 3 copies of the book. Academic Press was the publisher of it. And he got me on the phone and said, thank you very much. It's a very good chapter, and it's in the book, and we'll send you copies of the book. He said, I believe you're a member of a CLIC group, Clandestine Laboratory Investigating Chemists. A very good friend of mine created this little group for narcotics officers, narcotics chemists, to exchange information in a little monthly bulletin of things. And he invited me to join them, and I was a charter member, and I was the only person who was a member of the CLIC group that was not a narcotics officer or a chemist, either federal or state or county. And I not realized I was the only one who was not a member of this sort of thing. And this fellow in Canada said, I happened this year to be the president of that group. He said, are you aware of the fact that you're the only person, that's why they'll never have meetings from big wigs from Washington, because I'm a member. I said, I never realized I resigned. I'll send you my resignation right now. He said, that'd be very kind of you, thank you. And then the group can become itself. And as long as you're sending your resignation, let me tell you something else, he said. And this was volunteered by him. He said, how long has it been since you've seen your friend, I will not give his name, your friend who lives out here who's a chemist? We used to go out to dinner once a month. I have not seen him for many months. You'll never see him again. Is he okay? Oh, he's fine. It's just all the chemists in the DEA have been told they cannot make any contact with me. You're not allowed to. And if I make contact with them, they have to tell their boss and tell Washington. And they have been put into, the term in England is called being sent to Coventry, where you are not allowed to communicate or can be communicated to. Namely, you can't exchange any information. The Catholics, prisoners of the Protestant War, sent the Catholics to the town of Coventry, where they had no communication. And I'm not allowed any communication with the chemists. No, they're not allowed to have any communication with me. They're all been sent to Coventry. And so I've lost all contact with the people I know. And that's the way they want it. And I'll say it's okay, fine.
They still kick up quite the storm, don't they?
No, they do indeed.
My gosh. So let's go back to those first experiences with mescaline, if you will. Recreate a couple. I mean, how did you stumble across it for the first time?
I was offered a babysitting, to have a babysitter, and he was a psychiatrist, and there were about 3 or 4 of us who were the experimenting subjects of the test, and there were a couple of babysitters to drive the car and to make sure everything goes smoothly. And I had a reasonably heavy dosage. I think it was 350 or 400 milligrams of the sulfate salt. And we drove up in the Berkeley Hills along Skyline Boulevard. And I remember getting out of the car to go over and look at the flowers. And I couldn't step out of the car because I saw the gravel outside the car as being the back of a snake. And I did not want to step on a snake. And I realized I was seeing things through different eyes and a different way. I went over to a flower and I looked inside the flower, and I fortunately had cut it before I looked too close to see how beautiful it was so I could take it back with me. And I was amazed. There was a bee in there that looked up at me and ignored me and went on its gathering of pollen, where bees gather out of flowers. And I just watched the little insect putting pollen in little things on its legs and gathering up the things for the beehive to make honey out of them, I guess. Absolutely fascinating. I saw things I had never seen before. Probably seen, but never really paid attention to. And I took the flower back with me, and we went back to living in Berkeley at that time. And I looked at the flower, and inside the flower, the blossom had opened up, having been picked. It opened up a little bit. And I looked down inside and see this absolutely beautiful colors and beautiful shapes and designs, and the things that hold pollen in a flower were gorgeous. And I would love to have looked deeper inside, but I could not bring myself to tear the petals open because it's just too beautiful. And to me, I did not realize at that time, it was not the compound that was producing the effect, it's a compound allowing me to produce this interpretation. So it's a catalytic thing. It's not a drug effect. It's a drug allowed effect, but it's catalytic permission. And sometime later, I made modifications, put a ethyl group in place of a methyl group, and we went up in the hills again and gathered, stoned as all get out, gathered flowers again. This time brought them back to the house, and I could just tear the flower open to see what's inside. So I realized all these materials may be stoning and may be psychedelic, but they all are different. And I was totally fascinated with what structure modification. Enough of a chemist I could modify structures, enough of a curious person that I could taste what I made with enough care. Then we got a research group together of about 8 or 10 people. And so once I had found out what it is, the activity potency is, then we would meet in Anna's part of that early research group. She would take it and verify that I'm in the right area for dose. She takes a slightly lighter dose than I did. And then we get the group of maybe 8 people together, and each of them knew that they're sensitive or not sensitive, would call their own dosages. And the group of 8 people then would make comments, and that would be the basis of publishing. So in essence, it's a collective amalgamation of about 8 or 10 different reports. So in essence, it's not one person and his idiosyncratic response that may be abnormal, but a group of 8 or 10, of which maybe one is aberrant, one's a little too sensitive, one's too insensitive, but on the average you get a picture of the potency and the effect of the material. And then that's the basis of publishing. Then make a new material. And it's worked out to be a fascinating challenge.
You know, I'd like to get to numbers and just see whether you could come up with at least a ballpark estimate. How many compounds have you yourself come up with that had psychedelic effects?
New psychedelics?
Mm-hmm.
Probably between 150 and 200.
And considering all the types there are and your many years of research, how many different types of psychedelics do you think you've taken?
I would say if you get to know the psychedelic reasonably well, everyone is different. You've met how many people in your life? How many different types of people have you met? Everyone's different. And that's true with the psychedelics too. Some of them are unusual, some of them are unpleasant, some of them you get toxic effects and you don't want to go on because there are side effects that are not desirable. But everyone is different.
Tell us a couple of trip stories, and it may be a particularly bad one or a particularly good one.
Well, one of the bad trip experiences was a heterocyclic ring system on the nitrogen of tryptamines. I forget, I think it was the 2,5-dimethylpyrrolidine or some substitute that was in a cycle. And knowing the mass of the carbons out there and having experience with that kind of a weight on the nitrogen, I figured the active dose would be around maybe 10 milligrams, 10, 12 milligrams. But I always work in from the microgram level up every few days to sneak up on where the activity level is. I got up to about 1 or 1.5 milligrams and I got very sick. So I laid off of it for a week and a half and then repeated that same thing because there might have been something in me or diet or what have you, and got very sick again. So the activity level may have been up here, but the toxicity level is down here. And that, I just dropped the whole thing. But it's not always bad. It can be one material I once had an experience with. I'd had it 2 or 3 times and getting prepared to go to the group. And I got into what I call a bliss state. Usually what I do, I give minus no activity, plus minus probably the beginning of activity, plus is active, but you can still drive a car with that, be careful. 2 pluses would be you are really getting in and not driving a car thing. 3 pluses, you're fully stoned. So sometimes you have a 1 plus response, sometimes a plus and a half, 2 pluses, 3. And then I had one thing in which I gave 4 pluses, which is a bliss state, in which I could look at an animal coming across the field down below the house, and the animal would see me and I'd do this, and the animal would just run away as fast as it could. I controlled everything around me. I was in complete control. I said, this is a tremendously powerful event, and it's a bliss thing. Then I realized, my God, what if this never went away? And you stayed there. And it's kind of scary, where you can control everything just by thinking about it. And if I'd had the drug before and I've had it after, never had the thing. It was just me that day on that thing. And it was very kind of scary. I've had that bliss state twice. I call it +4. And I don't choose to have it again. And yet, it's a very interesting experience.
Yeah. I want to tell you quickly about an experience I had. It was simultaneously the best and the worst trip I had. It was probably late 60s, and we ground up some baby Hawaiian woodrose seeds. And I guess there's a natural form of acid that is...
Yes, it's a ergot material.
Yeah. And we didn't know dosage. I think I took 12 or 15. My girlfriend might have had 10. And we did it with some other people. And it quickly became apparent that this wasn't necessarily something you did in a group. Amazing again, and tying in very much to what you were saying about how different the trips can be, and
The Hawaiian baby woodrose is really basically it's quite similar to the poppy seed, the seeds of the morning glory. Thank you. Yeah, morning glory seeds. They're very closely related. The baby woodrose has a 4-petal thing. The morning glory has a 5 and 3 seed, but 5 petals. There's a Hawaiian woodrose, totally different and totally inactive. It's the baby woodrose.
Yep.
It's the plant. I raised quite a bit of it to get the active materials out and see what they were. And I think I published it somewhere, the actual active components. But they're ergot compounds.
Gotcha. So the last time the DEA visited your lab, did they take material away?
If they did, I don't know. They might very well have, but I know they can find nothing illegal because there's nothing there illegal to find.
Yeah.
And so I didn't pay much attention. They finally had a search warrant Xerox to them.
Well, that was nice.
What they're doing now suddenly became legal.
Oh, good.
Let it be.
Sooner or later.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
No, what I've done, and it works out, I think, quite well. I have on the door of my lab, I have a little sign that's inside of a plastic thing so rain won't interfere with it. It's on the door, and it said, "This is a research laboratory that is known by and approved by the federal, the state, and the county narcotics groups." And I gave a name of a person in the federal and a phone number, name of a person in the state and a phone number, name of the person in the county and a phone number, and I put that on the outside door of the lab. I don't know if it's been effective, but certainly I've not been bothered.